Every 4 years, politicians promise the world better jobs, lower taxes, universal healthcare, and so much more. Yet, within months of taking office, those promises often fade away. Why does this keep happening? Why do politicians make promises they know they can't keep? It turns out, it's not an accident. In fact, studies show that 70% of campaign promises are never fulfilled. Shocking, right? Here's something even more eye-opening. A 2020 survey found that nearly 60% of voters felt they were misled by politicians' promises. That's millions of people left disappointed and disillusioned after every election cycle. So why do politicians continue making these unachievable promises? In this video, we'll dive deep into the strategies behind these broken promises. We'll look at how politicians manipulate voter expectations, why promises are used as power tools, and the unexpected consequences that follow. Get ready to learn why what they say on the campaign trail is often far from what they'll deliver. Chapter 1: The Promise Mirage. How politicians create unrealistic expectations. Politicians are experts at creating promises that are almost too good to be true. They know that to win votes, they need to make grand claims that inspire hope. But these promises often belong in the too good to be true category. Have you ever wondered why they promise things like, "I'll fix everything in 100 days"? It sounds exciting, but reality says otherwise. The truth is, these promises are designed to be idealistic, knowing full well they can't be kept. One famous example is President Obama's promise of hope and change. The slogan was perfect for energizing voters, but it became clear that large-scale change wasn't as simple as it sounded. Why? Because politicians often promise sweeping reforms without acknowledging the complexity of the issues at hand. They know that the bigger the promise, the more likely people are to believe it, even if it's unrealistic. A study by the University of California revealed that political candidates are 70% more likely to make sweeping promises during election campaigns, especially when they focus on future change. It's all about the psychological effect. People crave hope, and promises give them a sense of optimism, even if those promises are impossible to keep. But the promise mirage goes beyond just crafting catchy slogans. Politicians strategically target the emotional needs of voters. For example, if a candidate promises lower taxes, people will latch onto the idea of more disposable income, ignoring the complexities of how taxes work. These promises aren't meant to be kept, they're designed to make voters feel good in the moment. Chapter 2: Power, not policy. Why unkept promises are a political strategy. It might sound strange, but sometimes not keeping promises works in a politician's favor. Breaking a promise can actually help a politician maintain power. Why? Because once they're in office, fulfilling a promise can often be too costly or too difficult. Let's take the case of political gridlock. In many countries, the political system is designed to slow things down. Check and balance structures, party opposition, and bureaucratic hurdles make it almost impossible to enact large-scale reforms quickly. So, the promises that politicians make during campaigns are, in many ways, designed to appeal to voters without the expectation that they will be fulfilled. Political strategist James Carville famously said, "It's the economy, stupid." During elections, politicians often promise economic improvements or job creation. Yet, once in power, most politicians realize that fixing the economy isn't as simple as pushing a button. Economic conditions are influenced by global markets, inflation, and unforeseen crises, things beyond their control. An analysis by the Harvard Kennedy School found that 60% of campaign promises are never kept due to this reality. Politicians often overestimate what they can accomplish during their term. They want to hold on to power and please voters, but the political system simply doesn't allow for all their promises to be delivered. This dynamic isn't just about policy. It's about creating a perception of progress. Even when politicians don't keep their promises, they're good at making people think they're working hard. In the end, it's the illusion of effort that counts, not the actual results. Chapter 3: The Vote Magnet. Promises as temporary fixes. Election promises are often like quick fixes, designed to attract voters in the short term. Politicians know that voters are more concerned with immediate relief than long-term solutions. Think about promises like, "I will cut taxes," or "I will bring more jobs." These sound great, but they don't always tell you how those goals will be achieved, or if they're even possible. Studies show that voters are particularly responsive to promises that offer immediate benefits. According to a 2018 report by the American Political Science Association, politicians who promise immediate, tangible benefits, like tax cuts, increase their chances of winning by 15%. The catch, though, is that these benefits often come at the cost of long-term planning. While voters are pleased in the short run, they're left wondering why the problems persist after the election. Politicians often use promises to fill a temporary gap in public sentiment. If there's a crisis, they might promise immediate relief, like healthcare reform or job creation. While it sounds promising in theory, the scope of the problem is often too large for quick solutions. Think about how healthcare reform has been promised by politicians for decades. Every election season, a politician promises to overhaul the system. But once they're in office, they quickly discover that making sweeping changes takes time, and a lot of cooperation between different branches of government. This is why promises about things like universal healthcare or free college are often left unfulfilled. In some cases, politicians will promise solutions to complex issues without a clear path to implementation. They rely on voter impatience and hope that people will forget their promises when the next election comes around. It's a cycle of promise, disappointment, and more promises. Even though these promises are often short-sighted, they work because they exploit the natural human desire for immediate solutions. If voters are struggling with unemployment or healthcare costs, politicians know that a promise to solve these problems quickly will resonate. The sad reality is that these promises rarely hold up when put into practice. If you're enjoying this breakdown of political promises, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and stay tuned for the rest of the story. Chapter 4: Behind the Curtain, the unseen forces shaping broken promises. Politicians don't make promises in a vacuum. There are hidden forces behind the scenes that influence the promises they make, often leading to them being broken. One of the biggest factors? Money. Lobbyists, donors, and powerful interest groups shape policies by pushing their agendas on politicians. Once a politician takes office, those promises may need to be adjusted to satisfy their backers. Research from the Center for Responsive Politics shows that in the US, nearly 30% of campaign contributions come from special interest groups. These groups fund political campaigns with the expectation that their money will influence policy decisions. That means politicians often find themselves torn between the promises they made to voters and the pressure from these financial backers. In many cases, politicians make promises they can't keep because they are beholden to these backers who have different priorities. For example, a politician may promise to tackle climate change, but once in office, they may backtrack due to lobbying from fossil fuel companies. This dynamic helps explain why so many campaign promises, especially those related to environmental reforms, often go unfulfilled. Even if a politician wants to keep a promise, the forces behind the scenes can block progress. The concept of the revolving door describes how former government officials often move into lucrative jobs with corporations they once regulated. This creates a tangled web of interests that can prevent politicians from making good on their promises. This idea is not new. In his book The Irony of Democracy, political scientist Thomas R. Dye explains how the relationship between politicians and powerful interest groups often leads to broken promises. Politicians find themselves making deals behind closed doors, leaving voters in the dark about the true reasons why their promises were never fulfilled. Chapter 5: Unintended Consequences. When empty promises come back to bite, broken promises often have long-term consequences. When politicians fail to deliver on their promises, it can lead to voter disillusionment and loss of trust in government. People become frustrated when they realize their leaders haven't followed through on their campaign vows. This disillusionment can lead to lower voter turnout and more polarized politics. A 2020 study by Gallup found that 58% of Americans said they didn't trust the government to do what is right. That lack of trust can often be traced back to unkept promises. When voters feel like they've been lied to, they start questioning the entire political system, which leads to apathy and disengagement. Politicians lose the faith of their supporters when their promises ring hollow. The unintended consequences don't stop there. Politicians who break promises also risk their political careers. The frustration of voters can result in a dramatic shift in support during the next election cycle. Take the example of former British Prime Minister Theresa May, who saw her popularity plummet after failing to deliver on key Brexit promises. Her inability to follow through left many voters feeling betrayed, which ultimately contributed to her resignation. Another consequence of unkept promises is the rise of populist leaders. When traditional politicians fail to deliver, voters often turn to outsider candidates who claim they will drain the swamp or break the system. While these leaders may make more promises, their rise is a direct result of dissatisfaction with the status quo. The more promises are broken, the more fertile the ground becomes for populist movements to thrive. Interestingly, political scientist Nancy Rosenblum, in her book On the Side of the Angels, argues that empty promises can paradoxically lead to greater political participation. When voters feel betrayed, they often become more active in seeking change, even if they don't necessarily know how. The frustration from broken promises can turn into a desire for reform, giving rise to movements like Occupy Wall Street or the Tea Party. If you're still with us and want to learn how we can fix the broken promise cycle, be sure to subscribe for the final chapter. Chapter 6: Breaking the Cycle. Can we hold politicians accountable for their promises? So, how can we break the cycle of empty promises? Can politicians be held accountable for what they say during campaigns? The answer is complicated, but there are steps we can take to demand greater accountability. One potential solution is increasing transparency in the political process. Politicians should be required to clearly outline the steps they will take to achieve their promises. A promise to cut taxes should come with a clear plan for how to make it happen, including any trade-offs or challenges that might arise. Transparency could help set realistic expectations for voters and prevent politicians from making empty claims. There is also a growing movement for stronger fact-checking during campaigns. Websites like PolitiFact and FactCheck.org already hold politicians accountable, but more needs to be done to ensure that promises are followed up on after the election. This could involve setting up independent commissions that track promises made by politicians and assess whether they were fulfilled. This way, voters could have a clear record of what politicians have or have not done. In his book The Audacity of Hope, President Barack Obama touched on the idea of building a new politics of responsibility. He argued that politicians should be more transparent and willing to explain why they can or cannot deliver on their promises. While this idea remains difficult to fully implement, it offers a glimmer of hope for holding politicians more accountable. Another idea gaining traction is voter-driven accountability. In countries like Denmark and Sweden, politicians are held to strict standards when it comes to delivering on promises. If a politician fails to fulfill their commitments, voters are quick to demand change, which leads to greater political responsibility. This type of accountability encourages politicians to think twice before making unrealistic promises. But perhaps the most effective solution lies in voter education. The more informed voters are about the challenges of governance, the less likely they are to fall for empty promises. If citizens understand that complex issues require long-term solutions, they will be less likely to expect instant fixes from politicians. It's about creating a culture where voters hold politicians to realistic standards. In the end, holding politicians accountable for their promises is a shared responsibility. Politicians must be more transparent, voters must be more informed, and systems of checks and balances must be strengthened to ensure that promises aren't just empty words. Breaking the cycle of broken promises is the key to restoring trust in government, and ultimately, in democracy itself. Don't forget to subscribe for more insights on how we can demand more from our leaders.